I know many of you are interested in innovation, and so before we got going, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about the innovation of behavioral economics. There's a lot of historians who've studied innovation, and one of the big myths about how new things come about or great ideas happen, like let's take the electrical battery, is that some great innovator has some brilliant idea, and that pushes us forward. In fact, this is a pretty deep myth. And it's a myth because the electrical battery, for example, was invented twice, separately, by two different people in its basic form, once in 1745 and once in 1746. The same is true of the law of conservation of energy, one of the most basic principles. That was invented 4 times separately, independently. In fact, I'm going to read you a bunch of things. The telephone, the telegraph, the steam engine, the photograph, vacuum tube, radio, nearly everything you can think of was invented not by one person or one thing, but by many people. It's almost like ideas are in the air. And if an idea is in the air, just like a virus, more than one person is likely to catch that idea. I'm telling you all this because I think that's not the case with behavioral economics. I think that behavioral economics was exactly invented by Richard Thaler, and I think if Dick didn't exist, we wouldn't have behavioral economics today. So it's a pleasure to have Dick around. Well, maybe not for people who don't like behavioral economics, but be that as it may, you're to blame. So my goal today is actually, and my task today is very, very hard. It's to get Dick to tell stories, and that's a really hard thing to get Dick. No, that is going to be the easiest thing in the world. So what I thought we'd start, Dick, is by maybe talking about Save More Tomorrow, which is, I think, of one of the most useful applied successes of behavioral science. Maybe you can tell a little bit about that.
Okay, sure. So, Sendhil's joke is that I mostly just tell stories. So, and you should know that I met Sendhil when he was 17 as an undergraduate at Cornell. And this is basically a continuation of a conversation we've been having for 20-some years. So we're sharing this one with you. Sendhil plays a cameo role in this story. And so does Boston, more than a cameo role. So I had been thinking about problems of self-control and saving from sort of a theoretical perspective right from the beginning. And at one point, Fidelity, the local mutual fund company, asked me to come and give a talk here in Boston to all the clients of their 401k plans that they administer, defined contribution plans. And they said, maybe you could think of some way to help people save more. And if you could include that in your talk, that would be great. So, okay. So I started to think about that. Now, here's the story part. I live in Chicago. I go out to O'Hare, and I'm meeting some Fidelity people for dinner, and then the next morning I'm giving my talk. I get to the airport, I realize I don't have my wallet. This is before 2011. This is sometime in the mid-90s. Now, you could still get on an airplane at that time without an ID, but then what? So, I had a few minutes of trying to figure out how was I going to check into my hotel? How was I going to get from Logan? That's where you came in. I figured, all right, I can call Sendhil. He'll pick me up at the airport. And, he was a grad student. He might even have $10 he could loan me or something like that. Then I had a better idea. I called somebody at Fidelity that happens to own a limo company. And anyway. So before that, though, I did spend some time thinking about this problem of what do I know that might be useful in helping people save more? So one thing I decided to do that is sort of different than the way psychologists, say, typically work, is I decided not to try one thing. I decided to throw everything I knew at this problem and figure collectively these things might work. So what's the first thing I do? Well, we all have difficulty with self-control, but self-control is a little easier to accept if it's sometime off in the future. So many of us are planning diets next month, certainly not tonight. And so that was the first thought, that maybe we can implement some idea in which people can act on behalf of their future self later. What's the second thing I know? I know a lot about what we call loss aversion. Something Danny might have talked about. So roughly speaking, losses hurt twice as much as gains make you feel good. So I said, okay, maybe we can use that. And then the third thing I knew is there's a lot of inertia in these plans. There was a fact floating around in the mid-'80s. Many professors have pension plan TIA-CREF, which at that time had two options. TIAA, which was fixed income, and CREF, which is stocks. More than half the professors in the world had exactly a 50-50 asset allocation, which was obviously the solution to some complex problem that they had solved. But here's the more interesting fact. The median number of changes to their asset allocation over their working lifetime was 0. Which means half the professors never made a change. They signed up the first day of work and never changed it. So we've got self-control in the future. We have loss aversion. And what was the third one? I'm like
Status quo.
Inertia.
Rick Perry.
My Rick Perry moment. I'll never become president. So how can we put those things together? So the plan I came up with, I called Save More Tomorrow. And the idea was you approach people, say around this time of year, and say, would you like to start saving more, say, in January? Or if we want to incorporate loss aversion, would you like to start saving more when you get your next raise? Because people don't like to see their pay go down. So when you get your next raise, that's a good time to get people to save more because they can take it out of the raise. And then the inertia part, once people sign up for that, they're in until they opt out. Well, so I presented this to 500 plan sponsors at Fidelity, and I figured this is such an obviously good idea. People are going to be calling me, and we'll get somebody to do it almost immediately. Nothing. Nothing. No one. And then anytime I would speak to any kind of financial practitioner group, I would bring this idea up. Nothing. So maybe 8 years later, a small company in Chicago decides they have a problem with their plan participants, and they hire a consultant to help them. And it's a small company, 300 employees, and they hired this guy with his computer to go around and talk to each employee. And they say, Sendhil, 1% is not really going to do it. Maybe you should be saving more. And the people would typically say, oh, well, I can't, just barely making it. People weren't very highly paid in this company. So he said, well, how about if you, and he had some computer that would calculate how much they should be saving. And most of them were hopeless. So he said, well, okay, how about if you increase your saving by 5 percentage points? And most of them said, no, can't afford that. So he was sort of desperate at that point. And he said, all right, maybe, how about, there's this guy Thaler, he has some crazy idea. Why don't you try this? So he offered people the opportunity to sign up to increase their saving by 3 percentage points the next time they got a raise, and then every time they got a raise. And we quadrupled saving rates in a little over 3 years. Now, then the miracle was, another one of my former students, Shlomo Ben-Artzi, somehow knew this guy who was the consultant, got the data, and we were able to write it up. And then it started to spread. So the idea, I don't think if that company hadn't tried it, we might still never see it. The same is true for automatic enrollment. Bridget Madrian, a faculty member here, I remember came to see me. She was a colleague at Chicago at the time. She came to see me. She says, I've got these weird results I can't make any sense of. So another Chicago company, or I think maybe it was a Wisconsin company, had tried this idea of automatically enrolling people in the plan, which is just switching the default. Normally, when you first are eligible for a plan, you get a big pile of papers that you have to fill out, and if you don't fill them out, you're not in. So this company had tried. The top page says, if you don't fill out this pile of papers, we're going to enroll you at 3%. And previously, new employees would sign up, about half of them would sign up within a year. When they switched the default, it jumped to about 90%. Now, Bridget wasn't a behavioral economist at this point. So she comes into me and says, do you have any theory that can explain this? Because to an economist, this makes no sense. This savings plan is highly advantageous to the workers. At this company, there was a 3% match. So if you put in 3%, the company put in 3%, that's an immediate 100% return on your money in one day. And all you had to do was make it easy. And that's become my mantra. So if you want to get people to do something, the first thing to do is figure out if it's something they want to do, which is typically what we're trying. If we want some farmer to plant some seed that's going to grow more, they want to do that, right? We're rarely trying to nudge people to do something that's against their best interest. So why do you have to nudge them? Well, maybe they don't know, or they lack the self-control, or what have you. If you just ask yourself, what's the obstacle that's preventing them from doing the thing that's in their best interest? And you remove that obstacle, amazing things can happen.
What's interesting about that is that I often feel like when people hear these things, they sound so obvious at some level. They're like, well, of course, change the default. Of course, make it easy. But it's worth going back to the 401k example and seeing how not obvious that is, in the sense that before we had Save More Tomorrow, before we had defaults, I think the policy options on the table were we really need to increase the subsidy, the tax subsidy, increase the match, or we need to do financial literacy. right? It was like people aren't saving, they don't understand, or it's not lucrative enough. It's very rare, and so you've thought a little bit about financial literacy.
Right. In fact, well, it turns out neither of those help.
Exactly.
So the first point is a good one because economists' standard economic theory really has exactly one lever, which is price. You want to get somebody to do more something, lower the price. If you want to get them to do less, raise the price. That's it. Now, when it comes to saving, economic theory doesn't really offer any advice as to how to get people to save more because the theory says they're already saving exactly the right amount. So there's nothing you can do. They've solved it. But if, for some reason, you thought you wanted to do it, the natural way would be to subsidize it, say by creating a tax shelter. Well, Raj Chetty, one of Sendhil's young colleagues in the economics department, recently did a study that I've wanted to do for 20 years and couldn't do it because the data didn't exist. So he went to, the question is, if you do some of these things, like automatic enrollment and save more tomorrow, do people actually save more? Or do they just, if they're rich, do they just shift money from some other account into this one? Or if they're poor, do they have money here, but they're running up credit card bills? So Raj went to Denmark, where there are apparently no secrets. And they have had a wealth tax. And so they have balance sheet information on every citizen. And they've made several of these kinds of changes over the years. So he and his co-authors were able to answer this question. And here's what they find. The tax subsidy does essentially nothing. The only thing it does is it motivates rich people to shift as much money as possible into tax sheltered accounts. 99% of the work is done by what Cass Sunstein and I call the choice architecture. Take whatever the automatic part is, that's what they're going to save. If you raise it, that's so. Yeah. So the tax incentive part just doesn't help. Now, financial literacy. I write an occasional column in the New York Times and had one last week about financial literacy. That Sendhil and I agree about this, so I'm going to wrap you into my controversial views. The sentence I had in that column is that financial literacy, efforts to improve financial literacy are laudable but not helpful. And here's what I mean by that. The problems that we have to solve in our current world, figuring out how much to save for retirement, choosing between a complex array of mortgages, these are problems that are hard even if you have a PhD in economics. Teaching somebody about compound interest in high school, I'm all for it. As I said in the column, it has to be at least as useful later in life as trigonometry. When's the last time you used a cosine? And do you remember what it is? I don't. Putting some compound interest instead of I think on that margin we can do some improving. But if we think teaching people that stuff is going to help a lot, we're fooling ourselves.
I'm buying a car now, And I was trying to figure out, should I buy or lease?
Yeah.
This seems like a simple enough question. Like, what's the right choice? I spent like an hour on this. It's actually very, very, very hard to figure out such a trivial choice. And then that's when I had an epiphany. This is not how I want to be spending my hour. And there's something true about that, which is what's weird about financial literacy.
You know, there's something called Google.
What is it? Tell me more.
And you see, you type in,
No, that's
should
the
I
worst
buy or lease? And then,
That's where you're wrong, because what you get back when you, so for example, type into Google, should I invest in the stock market? I mean, it's not, I hate to, I feel like I'm bursting a bubble here, Dick. Google is not omniscient, full of like only knowledgeable people.
what about Siri?
Siri's better.
Siri.
Siri will answer it. No, but I think there's something interesting about this in that I actually feel like we put an overemphasis on people wanting to really be fully informed, understand. No, I just want to get the right choice, and I don't want to spend an hour on this. And so much of financial literacy is in the other direction. Let me teach you everything about, no, I don't want to know anything about mortgages. Tell me the right mortgage, and then I'll go outside and get it. I think there's like a sort of a tension between.
So you can imagine, if Sendhil finds this problem hard, you know, what's the, you know, he's a above average IQ, Sendhil. You know, what is the typical high school graduate working in a factory, much less some peasant working in a village? What is it that we think they're going to be able to decide what the rate of return is on putting in more fertilizer? So what can we do instead? Well, again, we can make it easy. So one idea that Sendhil and Eldar and Michael Barr had that was greatly misunderstood in Washington, but the idea is still smart and sensible, is to create a class of products. I now like to call them easy. They called them plain vanilla. I don't like vanilla, so I was thinking
Plain mint chocolate chip didn't go over very well.
So easy. So here's the idea. Let's have, this is their idea. Let's have a class of products like an easy mortgage. Maybe there's a fixed rate easy mortgage and a 5-year ARM fixed year mortgage. And if you want it to be easy, it has to have the following list of terms. It's sort of like a standard form lease. Now, what does this do? It almost doesn't matter exactly what those terms are. Hopefully somebody will be sensible in choosing what those terms are. But notice, if now all the 30-year fixed rate easy mortgages are identical in the fine print, we're back to a world where there's one sufficient statistic, which is the APR, the annual percentage rate. So if we go back a long time ago, there was this Truth in Lending Act, and in the US it said everyone had to report interest rates the same way using this specific formula. That's helpful, right? Because the two APRs are comparable, but they're not, if there's a 2-year teaser rate and then it resets according to some formula as to what LIBOR does, and we won't say anything more about that. Now all of a sudden APR is not a sufficient statistic. So if we can create products like this in all kinds of domains, then the shopping becomes very simple. And you'd like the buy or lease. You'd like there to be some calculator that's provided by Consumer Reports that says, compare the prices and here's what you ought to do. And that's
I often compare
that's
this.
what we ought to do.
I often compare this to Windows and Mac. So I used to use Windows. It always felt to me like Windows was extraordinarily complicated, and it was forcing me to learn to use it. Whereas with the Mac, I felt like it was adapting to me. And I feel like we have financial products in that world, is that we put out these fairly complex financial terrain, and then we say to customers, hey, you have to figure out how to interact with this terrain because it's so complicated, as opposed to, here is the simple products we've adapted to you. In some sense, in so many other consumer markets, things are made easy for me, but in finance, for whatever reason, things seem to get more and more complex.
When you buy an iPhone, it doesn't even come with an instruction manual.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? There's some page that tells you how to turn it on. And then that's about all you need to know. So now, if you think about the sort of traditional financial literacy approach, and this can be true in any domain, agricultural literacy or nutritional literacy, we don't want to start teaching people the formulas that tell you how many calories you burn, right? I mean, make it simple, and make it as easy to operate as an iPhone or any good smartphone, any non-Windows smartphone, and then that will work.
Let's go back a little bit. You started talking about nudge. Do you want to you've already talked implicitly about it, but do you want to talk a little bit more about nudge and
sure.
The idea and how it comes?
Let me. So, you'll be shocked to know there's a story. So here's how nudge came to be written. Cass Sunstein was one of the first people I met when I moved to the University of Chicago. He was a professor in the law school, constitutional law professor. He's now defected and teaches at some university in Cambridge that we won't mention, and in the law school. So I was presenting a paper on Save More Tomorrow. Finally, after enough years went by and we got enough data, we wrote up a paper and presented it at a conference. And my discussant was Casey Mulligan, an economist who is hardcore Chicago school. And so Casey, I presented the paper and I showed that, we did this, this, and this, and we quadrupled saving rates. Isn't this cool? And so, Casey's, in his heart of hearts, knows this is impossible, what I've done. Because I didn't change any prices. And people were already doing the right thing. So, but, he can't really confront me with just making up the data. So he's sort of sputtering. And at the end he says, but let me ask you this. Isn't this paternalism? Now, I have to tell you, at the University of Chicago, there is no greater slander that socialist might be worse, but paternalist, I think, is about the meanest thing you can call somebody. And so I actually hadn't thought about it in that term, in those terms, because we normally think of paternalism as coercive. So, like when you're a parent, you have to eat your vegetables. So I was taken aback a little bit, and I said, "Oh, I don't know. I hadn't thought about it that way. There's no coercion here. So, I don't know. If we're going to call this paternalism, it must be some different kind of paternalism. I don't know. Maybe we could call it libertarian paternalism." So the next day, I was having lunch with Cass. We had a weekly lunch. And I said, Cass, I came up with an interesting phrase yesterday. I think there might be something in this phrase. And now, the phrase does two things. One is it makes a lot of people mad. That was a good thing. That was, So not just people at the University of Chicago hate paternalism. Lots of people hate paternalism. But libertarians are not really loved either. So here was my idea, right? This is obviously brilliant on the face of it. Take two reviled concepts that are contradictory and combine them. That was the idea I presented to Cass. And he said, oh, this is great. Why don't we write a book about it? Because Cass wakes up in the morning with an idea to write a book. So, so the way we use those terms, we think they're both lovable. So by paternalism, all we mean is helping people achieve their goals. So if somebody asks you, how do I get from here to the T station, and you point them in the right direction, then you qualify as a paternalist by our definition. If you point them in the opposite direction, not so much. Okay? So, by libertarian, we use that as a modifier. So it's a kind of paternalism in which people's choices are not removed. And so the book we ended up writing was, it's sort of an exercise in how much could we achieve in terms of social policy if we limit ourselves to interventions that don't require anyone to do anything. And all we do is make it easy and remove obstacles. And then, book publishers didn't think libertarian paternalism is an oxymoron, is not an oxymoron, was a winning title. I think someone told us we'd sell tens of copies if we had that title. And some benevolent editor at a publisher that chose not to publish our book suggested that we give it the title Nudge. And we thought that was such a good idea that we did it. And then we correctly were worried that the publisher that did choose to publish it might not be smart enough to realize it was a good title. So we wrote it in such a way that you couldn't possibly change the title. And by using that word on every fourth page or something like that. And so it's kind of amazing what's happened since. So when the book came out in London, there's a young guy there who was working for David Cameron when the Tories were out of office, part of a tiny group of people working for the shadow cabinet, as they call it, and Rohan. Rohan read the book and called my publicist, who he said, send me over some copies. So he had like 10 copies of this book on his desk. And one day, David Cameron walked by and said, what's this? And Rohan said, read this. So Cameron read it and then assigned it to all the Tory MPs for summer reading. Now, I have no idea whether any of them read it. But when they formed the coalition government, they ended up creating something called the Behavioral Insight Team that I've been working with ever since. And the main thing that they're doing is thinking about problems this way and then, crucially, collecting data on what happens. And we were just with the Obama administration has just recently decided to launch a similar initiative, and the young woman who's in charge of it, we were just with, Maya Shankar, she's on furlough. She's hoping to go back to work on Monday. We're all hoping she goes back to work on Monday. So the same idea is invading the US and is creeping its way. There's interest in South Africa and Australia, and I hope in all of the countries that you're from as well.
I mean, this idea has been so powerful and it's spread so virally that I remember when I was going, I met Dick as an undergraduate. I was in a class that you taught.
Right.
The word taught is being loosely defined here. There were 3 students in this class,
Yeah.
which was such a heavy teaching load that Dick decided to have 3 faculty teach it. So it was taught by 3 faculty, and half the lectures were guest lectures. Is that a good summary of the situation, Dick?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
that's-
Matthew Rabin we brought in.
That's right.
We couldn't handle you.
Exactly, there we go.
Such a troublemaker.
But then when I went on to grad school, you gave me one piece of advice, which was don't work on behavioral economics. I don't know if you remember you mentioned this
No.
to me. Yes, you were very clear. You said don't do a PhD thesis in behavioral economics. You need to get a job, and you need to work on a field that'll get you a job. It was really good advice, but it was also reflective of something that I think it's hard to see for most people now. Because now it's like, oh, obviously behavioral economics is very popular, but that was the right advice at that time. Behavioral economics was very much shunned. It would have been very hard to go on the market. I think David Lapson was the first person to go on the market, and then I was the second person, and it was only chance that we did well. It was really quite difficult. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the, it must have been a pretty heavy fight back then, and it's hard for people to kind of see that.
Well, I think, so here's a good example. My 3 of my friends won Nobel Prizes on Monday, including my regular golf partner, Gene Fama. And when in 1980, when I was starting to work on these kinds of things, people knew stuff. And they knew stuff that was wrong. But they knew it with very strong convictions. So one of the things they really knew was that you cannot predict future stock returns from past stock returns. And the proof is kind of obvious, that if you could, somebody would become very rich and then it would go away, so it can't be true. So I had a student, a guy called Werner de Bont, a Belgian, and he wanted to do a thesis in finance. And I said, look, I don't know any finance. But okay, sure, why not? So we tried something that I was accused of advisor malpractice in allowing Werner to work on this project. So it was kind of known, at least among practitioners, that value investing worked. And so if you buy stocks with low price earnings ratios, that earns higher returns. But this hadn't really been demonstrated with rigorous empirical methods. People like Benjamin Graham had written about it in the 30s, but it wasn't known. What was known is it couldn't be true. So, and there was also the worry that even if it was true, this is a ratio of price to earnings, and earnings is measured by accountants, and nobody trusts accountants. So maybe if the denominator is fishy, then who knows what could be going on. So we decided to do something really simple. And here's what we did. We went back to the finance tapes, they were called then. They were literally tapes. And stock price data going back to 1926. And we did the following experiment. We started in 26 and we took a 5-year period and we ranked all the stocks on the New York Stock Exchange by the return they had over that 5-year period, from the biggest winner to the biggest loser. And then we formed portfolios of the 50 biggest winners and the 50 biggest losers. And then we tracked those for the next 5 years. Now, what everybody knew is that the returns on those portfolios would be the same, because you can't predict the future from the past. What we found was what we kind of thought we might find, is that the losers massively outperformed the winners by about 40%. And we had a graph that showed this. And now, so we wrote this paper, and then we were very lucky. So we presented it at the American Finance Association meetings. And at that time, they had a proceedings volume, one issue a year, that was papers that were selected from those that were presented at this annual meeting. And they were selected by the president, the current president of the American Finance Association. That year, the president was Fisher Black, the guy who invented the Black-Scholes option pricing model. Now, Fisher was a quirky guy, and he liked quirky stuff. So he published our paper. I am 100% convinced that paper would never have been published if we had submitted it to a journal. And the reason is everyone knew it was wrong. So we had this really remarkable thing that we presented it in January. It was published in July. And then it's out there. And then all the graduate students at the University of Chicago Finance Department were assigned the job of finding our programming error, because it was the only possible explanation for what we had found. And it turns out there was no programming error. And Fama is actually, I tell him he owes the last 30 years of his career to me, because he's been spent sort of patching up. So
that's
how are we
it's a
doing
good
for time? Maybe we should open it up?
Yeah, why don't we, are there questions in the audience? Or?
Yeah.
Dick, thank you so much for these good thoughts. Can you envision a world in which even taxpayers would be nudged to pay their taxes? I mean, merely nudged.
Well, that's one of the first experiments. So I can tell you the very first meeting I attended with some people from the Behavioral Insight team in London was with a guy who works in Treasury, whose job it is to collect from people who owe money on their taxes. And I have a very vivid memory of this meeting. And we went in, and he had already been talking to somebody related to Bob Cialdini's consulting firm, the great social psychologist who wrote a book called Influence. Everyone should read that book. So basically most people, in the UK tax system is pretty simple. If you have wage income, you don't really even need to file a return. They call it pay as you earn. And so there are no deductions. It's all very simple. But if you have outside income, or you own a business, then you have to pay. And then the system is really stupid, because you have to pay 18 months later. You have to be saving up. So not surprisingly, those people, some of them owe money. So we said, well, what do you do with these people? We said, well, we send them a letter. And then if they don't reply, we send them another letter. And then if they don't reply, we send the bailiff. And so send it to a collection agency, which costs a lot. So what they had started doing with Cialdini's help, and then later with the help of this team, was changing the letter. So one of Bob Cialdini's basic tricks is, if you want to get people to do something, there's a right way and a wrong way. So the wrong way is to say, lots of people like you are not paying your taxes, and as a result, we're going broke. That's bad. The right way to do it is to say 90% of the people in this country pay their taxes on time, which happens to be true. That is a positive norm and encourages people to pay. So it turned out just making that change increased this letter. And then they started doing variations on that. If you say 90% of the people in your town pay their taxes on time, that works better. If you add that money from people's taxes is being used to build the new bridge in your town, that works better. So running this series of experiments, just running the experiments, has paid for the entire cost of this unit 100 times. And when it's rolled out, finally, it will bring in, at least tens of billions of pounds, maybe hundreds of billions of pounds. So now, what I would say is, and what I've been encouraging them to do is, let's not get ourselves into this situation. The reason 90% of the people pay their taxes on time is because it's automatic. And they could do a lot of things for the self-employed to make it easier for them, set up payment systems and so forth. So yes, we can nudge people to comply with their taxes. Now, there are some countries where you'd have to say, truthfully, 15% of the people pay their taxes. That would be a heavier lift, and you couldn't use that trick, so you'd have to use something else. But yes, we can do that.
Other questions?
Yeah.
What we're finding, as I understand it, is that the first round of reaction to this is nudges are cool. They work, they're great. We're finding sometimes nudges seem to work and sometimes they don't. As I understand it, for poor folks that are getting the earned income tax credit, which is a refund for low wages, they have low wages and extra tax rebate. Whether you have an opt-in or opt-out for savings doesn't seem to make much difference. Have we begun to get a more thoughtful story about when nudges work? Is that as simple as they didn't really want to save in the first place? Or how do you help us put together the Sendhil said this, I seem to keep hearing the same three stories from the behavioral insights team. I suspect there are 4 or 5 stories where it didn't work.
Well, I can, lots of stuff doesn't work. They sent out 8 different letters. Now, and then if one of them works best, you better replicate. I'm sure one of the stories you've heard is about insulating attics. Now, here the problem was, and this is a sort of a classic, the government wanted people to insulate their attics. And so what do? They subsidize it. And the take-up on the subsidy was zilch. So we met with this minister whose job it is to get people to insulate their attics. Now, insulating your attic is a no-brainer. The payback period is 1 year. Every rational economic agent already has insulated their attic. But a third of the attics were not insulated. Now, there were lots of ideas thrown around about how to do this. Some people on the team, this was during the period where Groupon was flying high. Some people on the team thought the idea that would work best would be to say, if you get a group of your neighbors to go in with you, we'll increase the discount. So that was one arm of the trial. Another arm of the trial was based on just going out and asking people, how come you haven't insulated your attic? And what people would say is, you know how much crap I have up there? It would take me a week to bring it all down, and then what would I do with it? So the insulation was installed by private retailers like Home Depot, whatever the Brit equivalent of that is. So we got one of those stores to run a trial where they would offer people a service at cost more than the insulation actually, to have two people come and clean out the attic. So they would bring the stuff down, help the homeowner sort it into piles, stuff to throw away, stuff to give to charity, stuff to put back upstairs. That worked. Make it easy. But we didn't know. I mean, I was betting on that. Other people were betting on other stuff. So not everything is going to work. That, you know, in every meeting that I go to, I say the same two things. They become our team mantras. Mantra 1, make it easy. Mantra 2, you can't do evidence-based policy without evidence. So pretty obviously true, but most policies are not evaluated. So, you know, I'm certain that some of the findings that the team has, I'm certain most of them will shrink because that's what happens. The ideas that seem to work best always work not quite as well when you take them to scale because some of that was noise. So some of the stuff will shrink, some of them won't be real at all. But if we keep running new experiments, and you know, they're running a lot of trials now in job centers where they're changing the routines both for the people looking for jobs and for the people that are advising them on how to look for jobs. I don't think they've cracked that. I mean, they've done some pretty simple things that seem to be steps in the right direction. So, you know, but I can tell you the biggest experiment is now being run right now, and it's 12 years in the making, which is they've rolled out essentially a national 401k plan called NEST. And it has automatic enrollment. And lots of people were saying, this won't work. And the early returns are in, and 10% opt-out rate, 90% in. And it's sort of automatic enrollment plus a primitive kind of save more tomorrow because it's starting at a very low rate, 1%. And then in a couple of years, it'll go to 3%, then 5%, then 7%. And so, yeah, not everything will work. But we won't find out what works unless we try.
Okay, thank you, Dick.